positive intent of a ReadMe is to jumpstart how you work with someone. And I tell folks that I manage the sooner we can come to a situation where you feel comfortable disagreeing with me and we have a disagreement, that means that we are working well together. So the goal of my ReadMe is to help folks, especially in remote environments, understand how I tend to work.
Hello, and welcome to Somehow I Manage Product Teams. I'm your host, Naveen Pichandi, and I'm on a quest to have conversation with product leaders to uncover how each of them skillfully wield the art of managing people and products. Today, I'm joined by Cassidy Fein. Cassidy was a senior director of product at Pendo and Vimeo, and has spent the last decade on product, particularly in B2B. More interestingly, worked all remote, and we'll talk a little bit about it in the end. Cassidy also teaches for the Mind the Product in her spare time and occasionally coach PMs at early stage of their career. In this episode, we talk about 1, the myth behind building B2B products, 2, how Cassidy built products at Pendo, as an example, and 3, Cassidy's ReadMe doc and how she successfully managed her career and has grown in the last decade, all working remotely. Let's get into it.
For management, press 5.
If you're really interested, it is called Somehow I Manage.
Hey, Cassidy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, of course. Excited to be here.
Fantastic. We'll start off with the most canonical question on the pod. Tell us a little bit about your story and your journey to being a product leader.
Yeah, I think, every product person I know around my age has a similar story of kind of coming to product from a very roundabout way. So I actually studied film in undergrad. I know we were just talking about this earlier, but this poster is from my internship at AMC. I really thought I wanted to be in development. I was so excited about it. I was supposed to start an internship right after I graduated. And then I quickly realized that that meant I would be fetching coffee and answering phones for 2 years before I could really do any sort of real work. I say real work in quotes. So at the time, I was crashing at a friend's apartment in New York, and it was 2011. So everyone and their mom had a Series A or Series B around, it seemed like. And this is like to set the kind of scene for folks. This was early Uber, pre-dating apps. It was a wild time in the internet. So I was chatting with a friend. He also had a similar sort of existential crisis post-graduation, or he was supposed to work for a large engineering company and realized he just didn't want to be, proverbial cog in a wheel. So we were both interviewing and met this founder. He seems really smart. This company seems really cool. Why don't you just come and let's kind of talk to them? And so I joke with people, I literally stepbrothers did an interview. Like I just showed up and the founder was like, who are you? Why are you here? And we got along. And he's like, look, I'll hire you for a few months. If it works out, great. If not, no hard feelings. And it just kind of went from there. It ended up being honestly one of the most formative and amazing experiences of my career so far. It was at a company called NewsCred. They rebranded to Welcome and then were recently acquired by Optimizely. And I'm still in touch with the CEO, Shafkat. He's an amazing person. And it really ended up being almost like a mini rotational program. So like any startup, you do kind of what needs to be done. So one day it was sales, one day it was customer success, one day it was QA. And I just ended up realizing that product was that perfect Venn diagram of what I'm good at and what I actually enjoy. So that's kind of how I fell into product. Yeah.
That's awesome. It's funny. I actually was this close to getting into the Vancouver Film School for a VFX program. So it's
Funny.
great to
Yeah.
hear others who are also super interested in getting into films. Uh,
Yeah, it's funny. The more I talk to folks, especially folks from non-technical backgrounds, the more I realize just how much the storytelling skill, the skills that you learn from, those types of programs are really vital within the tech industry and especially within product. Yeah, it's a lot more common than I think folks give it credit for.
there's a lot more in the product. There's once I wanted to write an essay about how being a director, like a movie director, is so close to being a
Hmm.
product manager, quite frankly.
Yeah.
Because as a director, you effectively don't control, you're not the one shooting, because there's a director of photography who's in control of the camera. There's a
Yep.
story writer, and then there are experts in each parts of, I guess, the filmmaking process.
Hmm.
but then you're this person who's influencing and making sure the right decision gets made. So there's a lot of parallels to be drawn there.
100%. And at the end of the day, everyone is coming to set and doing their thing. And if there's an existential crisis of like, why are we here? Why are we even bothering to do all this? Like you as a director need to kind of keep that center, keep that soul of the story going. Yeah, there's a lot of parallels. That could be a whole other podcast, I feel
For sure, for sure,
like.
for sure. And so in your recent experience, you were at Pendo and at Vimeo, and you were mostly running the B2B side of the business, right?
Mhm.
And I feel like I can ask you this question just because having spent close to a decade on B2B products, I feel like if you were to make an easy categorization of PMs, I'm sure you can, call PMs as a growth PM or, a 0 to 1 PM. There's so many different ways to split that, but the
Mhm.
almost easy split you can make is, are you in B2B or B2C? And then there are different characteristics that you can associate to what they're good at based on that, right? Now, having spent over a decade on B2B, I'm curious, what are some of the myths that you see about people building B2B products? Just because there's so much literature around B2C and there's a sexiness factor with B2C, not many people talk about B2B products and kind of the folks that build them, and what are some of the skill sets that comes with building B2B products?
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I feel like just the other day I was reading something and someone was joking, well, one route I could go is just sign up for, a soulless enterprise company and, print money and never talk to customers ever again. And that's the end of my career. And it just makes me very sad because I genuinely was on that side of, I guess, proverbial lawn as well, right? So early on in my career, I got, kind of put into B2B SaaS. NewsCred was a content marketing kind of SaaS platform, and we were primarily B2B. So I thought at the time I was going to ultimately end up at B2C. Again, kind of all of Facebook was just taking off. Instagram had kind of just, really found its legs. Snapchat was just starting. I thought that was where I wanted to be. And I quickly realized there is so much that you gain in a B2B role around the kind of systems that control everything from sales to how you interact with customers, how often you can interact with customers, to how your company makes money. That frankly, just I found to be more enjoyable and more satisfying. So whenever I coach folks or talk to folks who have that assumption or who make the assumption, I will say that just because you as a consumer enjoy a product doesn't mean you may enjoy working there or creating that product, which I think can be kind of mind blowing for a lot of folks that are maybe more junior. I strongly encourage folks to learn about the industries they want to get into, the regulations around those industries, the kind of norms and standards around those industries, and kind of everything that flows from that. So let's take an example: healthcare and technology. Healthcare is obviously a very regulated industry because it needs to be. Thank goodness it is. And because of that, sales cycles are much slower. Innovation cycles are much slower. And, your sales tend to be much larger when they are occurring. And you tend to have less kind of small to medium businesses that you're serving. Again, these are generalizations. It depends upon the company and what you're selling. With all those things in mind, that could mean really intense but also really fruitful and really exciting, handfuls of relationships with your customers or with folks that you are, trying to grow your products with, versus something like a B2C where you are running, multiple A/B tests a day for hundreds and thousands of millions of users. And, all of them are kind of specks of sand in, a giant desert. Whereas, maybe have, 15, 20, 25, 100 customers so you can almost tap on the shoulder and say, hey, I see you're utilizing these portions of our product portfolio. We're trying to figure out what's working, what isn't. Let's just sync. It's been a while. I love those really intense personal connections with our users and with customers. And I found that B2B for me is the best way to cement those and really get the most out of those.
No, that's a valid point. And the other thing that I was more thinking about was when you think about just B2B and B2C, like I feel like there are some unique skill sets that you develop being on either side of that, I guess, line. I ask that because I'd like to think PMs in general have to have a baseline set of skills of, you got to have your product sense, execution sense, your analytical and your strategic sense in some way. But what do you think makes B2B folks or folks building B2B products more unique in some way? Because I feel like you could spend your time on either of those categories, but the more
Mhm.
you spend time on, I think you drift apart in a way because you're so strong in one of them. It's almost like, do you do your legs exercise or you just keep doing bicep curls? You end up being heavy on one part of it or the other. What are those traits for B2B, you think? And I have some thoughts too. I'll share it, but I want to hear what you have.
Yeah, I'm curious what your thoughts are because I honestly keep going back and forth. I think that across all of those things you named, right? So, product sense, all of those things. B2B product managers obviously have to have those, but I think that they should act on that information potentially in different ways. And again, I keep going back and forth on this in my own head. So I'm curious what your thoughts are, and I'm curious what your listeners' thoughts are as well. Of there is obviously, again, kind of looking at the industry, differences around regulation and differences around timing and expected time to market. But I think ultimately it comes down to you are serving a customer that is then serving their own customers. So you need to be extremely careful and extremely mindful in things that may not necessarily be an afterthought, but may be okay to be a little less kind of hardened and thought through on the B2C side.
In my mind, at least based on my experience, and I've been on B2B for close to a decade too, I think there are two main areas that stands out to me.
Mm,
One is I feel like a lot of consumer products are somewhat over rotated in terms of its instrumentation in the way that they collect data for making most of their decisions. And I think a lot of it is from Facebook too. I think Meta did a lot of this instrumentation where they make every decision a data driven decision. I think most other companies have sort of gone down that direction where every minute decision is sort of an A/B test, and you carry forward from there. Not a bad thing to do. I mean, it works for them because I think the space that they're in is you can't just pick up a phone and call every single user and
yeah.
ask what do you like about it, what do you don't like about it. And they rather use data to make sense of the usage patterns and things like that. On B2B, we do have the luxury of, especially when you go enterprise, you do have the luxury of talking to some of your biggest customers, try to understand their problems a little more keenly. And so I think even if you aren't, I think you're data informed, but you're not to the level of you're crazy about trying to track a metric. That's one big difference that I see. And I've taken a few gut-based decisions during my time, and it's purely because we just didn't have enough data to make those calls. And I feel like that's kind of where you use a little more of a product sense on B2B, I think.
Yeah,
And I think that's a little different from most consumer companies, just because for every aspect of making a decision, they're always, I think, limited in the kind of data to support their decision. They leave less room for their gut, I feel.
I think that's a really great point. Listening to Lenny's podcast, he was interviewing the CEO of the browser company. I need to look up his name, otherwise
Josh
I'm going
Miller,
to butcher it. Yeah, yeah,
Josh is
yeah.
awesome.
He's great, and I found it really interesting because he spent a lot of time at Meta, and he talked about this kind of drive he wanted to push against of sort of over indexing on kind of relying on metrics and getting back to the feel and the heart and the sense of product management. And, I think I agree with him to a certain extent. I'm always afraid of kind of going too far and kind of just going with your gut. I don't know why this always reminds me of a really old Stephen Colbert sketch when he was still doing kind of his shtick and he always talked about truthiness. And it's like, I don't want to get into that kind of like mushy, middle. But I think that's right. You are still working with as much data that is relevant as possible, like in B2C, but you are working to make sense of more quantitative data rather than qualitative data. And I think that takes a lot of skill to take that data and digest it and present it in a way that is still as easily grokkable to multiple audiences, right? To sales, to support, to executive teams, to boards, to help them understand how, maybe 3 to 5 to 10 sort of, quotes from interviews or working sessions or, ultimately understanding a customer's kind of tip to tail flow, how that then should apply to decisions that need to be made versus, seeing, oh, this metric is up and to the right or, oh, this metric is down and, what do we do?
And I think the second big trait I've noticed is a lot of B2B folks have a better sense of second order effects with if you make a decision, how would it further impact? Just because there isn't a whole lot of notion of move fast and break things. You break things, you break big things here, right? You try and move fast, break things with healthcare, it's not going to end up well. And there are many other folks. Even if you build just software, there are healthcare institutions who might be using your software for some part of their IT operations or logistics, and like you can't break any part of that. You break any part of that, it could have bad repercussions at the end of the day. So I feel like when we build B2B products, folks think about second order effects a lot more. And yeah, I would think that that's pretty generic regardless of any B2B products that you build.
I completely agree. I think with that, though, can also come, like you said, this potentially over reliance on data or this feeling of when you do need to make a decision, especially if it's very different from previous historical decisions, that you are kind of trying to change the direction of a cruise ship. And I encourage folks to try to fight against that because there is still the ability to be relatively nimble as a B2B business. Certainly you can't just scrap everything and start, from scratch overnight, but there is still the ability to be nimble. And I just want folks to fight against this assumption that as a B2B software product manager, if you are working against these systems or you realize you need to make a dramatic shift, because that's not the case.
That's true. And then the counterpoint I think is as you end up in B2B for a very long time, then the notion can be since you're so good at detecting second order effects, you tend not to move as fast as the others,
Mm.
and you always kind of expect to be overthinking, and you end up moving a bit slower than the others, I guess. But yeah, no, it's a very interesting, I guess, thesis that I keep thinking about, and I'd love to talk to people who are in B2B just because there's just so much literature on consumer products, and they usually catch the limelight. You hardly ever hear the other side of the equation. So it's definitely an
Yeah.
interesting topic. I want to learn more about your game. How do you build products at Pendo? How is your team structured? How did you plan, prioritize, ship, and break it down for us? And maybe let's start with your team org. Like, how did you structure them and how did you go about rituals and planning?
So I led the platform team from the product side. I had an engineering partner on my side at my level. And then below us, there were 5 different teams, 3 of which were, I'd say, very kind of internally focused, things around data aggregation, storage, management, and a lot of, I'd say, kind of like legacy systems as well, which is interesting, is also where a lot of the kind of most mature and most seasoned engineers worked. When I came first joined, it was kind of the center of like, oh no, this thing isn't working and someone knows where the bodies are buried and they're probably on this team. That was at least when I started. We shifted away from that after I joined. And then the other 2 teams, one was focused on partnerships, integrations, and I'd say more external facing tooling. While I was there, we did a massive 0 to 1 launch of a tool called Data Sync, which allowed users to pull out the contextual, juicy Pendo data that they were generating and then port that into third-party storage systems, be it kind of GCS, Azure Blob, S3, et cetera. And so it was interesting because there was obviously a lot of overlap with those other kind of 3 initial teams, while still, it's interesting kind of weighing the differences in, I'd say, technologies that were very similar, but audiences that were widely different, right? One is, your own engineers and other engineers, and the other is engineers of your customers or, new customers. And then the last team is focused on design systems, accessibility, localization, internationalization. So again, similar audience to the first 3 teams in some ways, in other ways, a totally unique audience. Interesting mix of both, internal users and external users, and a really, really interesting mix. How do you work with kind of external customers where maybe accessibility isn't something that they're super familiar with, but they know that it's something they need to be compliant with. And compliance is a really scary word. So how do you kind of work with folks like that? For design system, how do you kind of get folks on board? How do you convince engineers that it is worth their time and effort to learn it and utilize it rather than spinning up something new and kind of not thinking about it, right? So lots of interesting problems and kind of different audiences. In terms of ceremonies and cadences, we were moving towards a continuous planning approach, but we were still kind of doing roughly quarterly planning, I would say. So nothing crazy there.
Did you use OKRs or any of that for planning? How did you all actually go about your quarterly planning?
Yeah, we use North Star. So just given kind of the collection of teams within our area and just the differences in the audience, I wanted there to be a unifying force, but I didn't want folks to get kind of lost in the weeds, especially because we had separate SLOs, SLIs, and SLAs that we worked with engineering leadership and engineers on the teams to be able to generate separately, right? SLOs, SLIs, SLAs should never, be your sole success metric unless you're a DevOps team. But we wanted that kind of in addition to a broader North Star. So we focused on quality, which is kind of more engineering focused in that SLO, SLI, SLA, and then scale. So effectively, are we supporting customers in a way where they understand the value of our platform and they feel confident that they can continue to grow and scale? And that sounds kind of really mushy I think from first glance, but really digging into it, it ensures that folks understand what we want to do, where we want to go, and gives folks a clear direction and rough kind of ability to say, you know, ultimately the goal for all these metrics, right, is to empower people to help them understand what problems we're trying to solve and why, and help them ultimately, if they need to kind of make these prioritization decisions on the fly or figure out, the best way to solve a problem when things change, make sure they're empowered with the right information and sort of guidelines in order for them to do it themselves without having to kind of always roll up these questions, because that just is not sustainable when you get to an organization of a certain scale, or I'd argue any scale, but that's how we worked. Yeah.
And how did you go about reviewing progress or progress towards goals and how the product's doing, like a product reviews, and how often did you do those, just out of curiosity?
Yeah. Again, would depend upon the product. For something that is in more sort of maintenance phase, honestly, we would just kind of monitor health metrics and ensure, things were going as expected, roughly around kind of quarterly planning. For something that was more 0 to 1, the team would do obviously kind of daily stand-ups and kind of weekly leadership check-ins. So I would meet with kind of the PM lead, engineering lead, the design lead, UX researcher lead, and QA lead, and just kind of see where we're at, what feels like it's working well, what maybe feels like we need to shift our thinking on or kind of dive back into or reprioritize. However high or low touch I need to be, I think is informed by the maturity of the product and kind of its historical proven success versus, kind of whether we're new to a certain market area or whether a product is new in our portfolio, if that makes sense.
Got it. I usually go into how people manage their teams and try to understand, how do you go about, the art of managing people outside of you building products.
Yeah.
And while doing my research for the episode, I came across a ReadMe doc on your website.
Yep.
And it's this document that you've written about how you work and your expectations. And I've read about this doc. I guess I've read about the idea on the internet a few times before, but this is my first time talking to someone who's actually written it. And I'd love to
Oh,
learn
great.
more. Let's start with, what was your motivation behind putting this together?
It's funny. I went back and forth on this a bit. I actually was vehemently against ReadMe docs when I first started because it, to me, felt like a very prescriptive way of here's how I work, and I'm an immovable object, and you need to form your work patterns and experience and attitudes and behaviors around me. And I hated that as someone that is highly collaborative and is really mindful of building, as someone that is really mindful about building kind of a open and collaborative, environment for teams. I hated it. And
Mhm.
so I just, went about my work without it. And I've worked remotely for some time. I worked remotely for a while pre-COVID, before it was cool. And as I continued my remote work, I looked to other remote leaders that I really admired. And I realized that a lot of them had README docs. So I took a step back from my previous assumptions. I read through and, I realized my assumptions were the negative way, I would say, of reading a README. The positive intent of a README is to jumpstart how you work with someone. And I tell folks that I manage, the sooner we can come to a situation where you feel comfortable disagreeing with me and we have a disagreement, that means that we are working well together. So the goal of my README is to help folks, especially in remote environments, understand how I tend to work, all those sorts of nuances that can sometimes feel a little bit lost in endless Zoom meetings, and just give folks the comfort of understanding, is it me? Is it her? What's going on? Do I need to respond to the Slack? Did she say something like this because, maybe she needs something else? No. And here's why, and kind of here's how I am roughly as a human being. Once I looked at it from that perspective, I realized it was something that I should probably have. So I took the time to build it. And as you can see, I think I do actually keep it relatively up to date as well. Yeah.
That was going to be my next question. I was conflicted in the same way that you were. First, my emotions were, first when I read it, I was like, fantastic idea. And then second, when I went through some comments online too, and there were a bunch of comments which were pretty negative. And that's when I understood, oh, wow, maybe people might think that you're this high and mighty, rigid person saying, this is how I work and you better fall in line. I was like, that's not what I want to be associated to. That's not me. And, but I've been going back and forth in my mind. Sometimes when you join a new company or you have a new manager, you just don't know how they work sometimes, right? And having a doc that explains how you work, like what's important to you, because I mean, believe it or not, everybody has a different management style, and there's no enigma to it. And I don't think you can argue that shouldn't be the case. Everybody should be out of a book. That doesn't happen. Everybody has different personal styles and what they expect and what they don't. And sometimes it's just easier when you're open about it and say, I care about these things and I don't care about these things. So don't waste your time on these things, right?
100%.
And
I think
so that's kind of why I was like, wow, this makes total sense. But I've been waiting to talk to someone who actually had one. And the fact that I saw you put a version and a date of last update almost immediately hit me, because I was like, this is also goes to show that this is not a rigid doc that I've written and I've never updated. You've gone ahead and updated a bunch of pieces, which is going to be your next question. Like, how often do you update and what did you update?
Yeah, yeah. I'm glad to hopefully have changed your mind on it. I think as soon as I started seeing it as a way to sort of speed run, folks feeling intimate with one another and understanding those kind of intangibles, like you said, then I really, really sort of leaned on it. Yeah, I kind of review it everywhere from monthly to quarterly. I would say in general, as I've become more of a senior product leader, I find that I live and die by my calendar. And I think that's so interesting because a lot of people are not very precious about theirs. Or I have a few friends that are product coaches, and every single one of them is like, I can't tell you, then I can easily tell you the number one problem every product leader has is their calendar, right? And so as soon as I heard that, I was like, okay, great. And so I make it a point to, at every company I work with, quarterly, I totally clear my calendar. Obviously, aside from meetings with direct reports, those are precious. But everything else, I will just kind of put down and question: is this necessary? I enjoy talking with this person and working with this person. I probably don't need to meet with them if we don't have a ton of initiatives that are overlapping or things that we think we'll need to discuss. So with that cadence, kind of also came everything else, within my career, whether it's ReadMe doc, looking at kind of things I've accomplished, things I want to continue to do, kind of a stop, start, continue for my own career. And then also, of course, thought leadership stuff. So applying to conferences, that tends to be kind of quarterly cyclical anyway. So really, when folks going to answer you on quarterly planning, like it is full on quarterly planning over here. But that's roughly how often I look at it. Yeah.
How do you use the document? Like, do you usually share it with your team when you onboard them? Or just curious, like how and what has been people's, I guess, response to it?
Well, first thing I do when I join somewhere is I share it with my direct reports, I share it with my manager, I share it with my skip level, and I put it in whatever chat communication platform that folks primarily use. So usually that's Slack or Teams. I will put it, either squeeze it into like my name, or if there's an area of like how to pronounce my name or something, I'll throw it in whatever little tiny area they give me. And so that way when folks are going to interact with me for the first time, they may look me up and see like, oh, this is Cassidy. Oh, what's this? Let me click this link. And it gives folks an opportunity to learn more about me. If I'm also doing a one-to-one with someone and it's my first time meeting with them, I will never send a calendar invite without a description. If you know me, that is a big thing for me, because if you've ever tried to request a meeting with me with no description, I will say no. But when I'm doing one-on-ones with folks I haven't met before, I will also put my ReadMe in there. And most folks will read it and be like, oh, cool, this is great. A lot of folks won't, and that's fine. Again, it's there to hopefully help. I haven't gotten any dramatically negative feedback, which actually makes me nervous. I feel like I should be asking people more pointedly. I have gotten the feedback that, some things conflict. And then I looked back and realized, oh, they do. I should update that. Or I think one thing I said is like, I realize this conflicts and this is just who I am. And I am a person of conflicting nature. Sometimes we're just human. Things happen
And
that
which one
way.
is that? I'm curious because that part of it was interesting to me because sometimes there's a version of me who I think I am, and there's a version of me who I actually am. Which one was it for you that you wrote on paper? It seemed to make sense. You thought that was you, but then it wasn't you.
Yeah, I don't know if it's still there. I may have edited it out in a recent update, but it was effectively, I will always get back to you no matter what day or time. And then the other was like, I will always respect your time off and I will, always make sure that I'm doing the same. And it's like, well, I'm not if I'm responding to anyone's Slacks like 24/7. And I realized that I'm the kind of person where even if I am on an extended break, I just want to kind of keep an eye on things and it's actually more relaxing for me that way. So I think I updated it to just kind of reflect that like I am just going to respond to things at weird hours and sometimes that's just how I am and you do not need to do the same and do not feel like you need to do the same. But it was interesting kind of taking a step back and like you said, you think of yourself maybe one way or going back to, I'd say the fundamental rules of user research, right? We all like to think of ourselves and our actions and our motivations in an idealized way. It's the reason why gyms are still in business. You oversubscribe and then people think, oh, I'm going to go 5 times a week and I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. And that's, of course, not always the case. And it's not done with negative intent. It's just kind of how humans are. So your viewpoint of who you are maybe cooperated 80% by someone you know really well or 40% by someone you don't know as well. And it's interesting, I've found as I get older to kind of find that middle ground of like where there is agreement, but at the end of the day, like you kind of have to live with yourself. And so that's really all that matters, I think. Yeah.
It's also a nice force function to do some self-discovery of
Mm.
if you were to write something on paper about what's your leadership style? Like it's a generic question, right? If someone were to ask
Mm.
you to write that on a paper, that's what this paper would look like. That's the way that I look at it. And it's phenomenal because I learned a lot when I was doing the research too, which is one, have your about me, tell what's important to you, what's not, and two, keep it updated. That's the most important because if you write one and you never looked at it, you're not true to yourself, and no one's going to care. And so I like that aspect of it. Put a version and a date because it shows both ways that you're taking it seriously and the person who's reading it knows that you're taking it seriously. I'm definitely
100%.
sold. How do I
Good.
start? Where do I start?
So you'll see at the bottom of mine, I give a ton of credit to other folks. Darren used to lead, I think, the remote group at GitLab. So it took a lot of motivation. Darren Murph, he was leading remote at GitLab. He's now VP of Workplace Design and Remote Experience, which is a really cool job. But he has been a huge proponent of remote work and just in general, kind of, I always enjoy reading what he has to say about things and learning from him. So I took a lot of this guide from him and from GitLab in general. I'm someone that is very passionate about remote work and it's funny. I don't mind going into an office, but I just think I have a lot of complex thoughts, which is probably another podcast in and of itself of this whole sort of back to office push and what that means and how folks work and collaborate effectively and how that happens across different mediums. But I took a lot of my inspiration from him and from those documents and kind of molded words into my own and just a lot of, taking a break, going back, looking, seeing, does this ring true to me? Does it not? Looking back a month, looking back after 2 months, looking back after a few weeks, looking back after meeting with a few folks and kind of running through your own intros and telling folks your story and your elevator pitch, right? Like I think anything, it just kind of grew over time and became more truthful over time. Yeah.
That's great. I will definitely link the, I guess, references that you have in your about
Great.
me onto the show notes too.
Great.
Although we could take a full episode to talk about the remote work, I still want to talk a little bit about it because the interesting thing is over the last 10 years, you've worked all remote. I'd love to hear what's worked, what's not worked. How did you lead teams remotely? And I guess was this about me doc that came about one of those exercises where you're like, I want to be able to lead our teams remotely, and that's kind of why I want to have like a doc. Is that why you put that together? I'm curious what other stuff that you've put together that helped you lead teams.
Yeah, it's a great question. What I've seen to be successful in remote teams is first and foremost, it has to start at the top. And so My first company where I worked remotely, they were a distributed company, but then there was a DC office. But the vast majority of folks were remote. We were a global business and we had folks in Perth, Australia, and folks in London, and folks in DC, and then kind of folks scattershot, I'd say, across the globe. And by the nature of that, you were all working in disparate time zones. This is why I have such kind of beef with back to office things, is because if you are a global company, you work in different time zones. Like you're not, you know, going from London to Perth to New York and back again every day. So like I don't anyway. So by nature of that kind of paired with COVID, we already had really strong, I'd say, kind of remote related work muscles in place. So things like every meeting is already a Zoom, and everyone kind of dials in from their desk or has a view of their face, even if most people are together, or meeting decisions and meetings in general are documented and shared out to a central location so folks have an understanding of what happened and why, and don't have to watch the whole meeting in order to get to that understanding. The necessity of kind of creating assets from these different day-to-day interactions and sharing them out and being mindful of how that asset is created, right? You don't just want to kind of dump a Zoom link into like 80 different Slack channels and then be like, good luck, it's in there somewhere, right? And it takes a little time to do those things. I think folks that don't have to do that now or haven't had to do that before can come to it a little bit begrudgingly, but as soon as you start to realize the value of it from other teams and other people, it becomes kind of like muscle memory. And it's a good muscle to flex because I feel like it applies in other areas as well. When you are collecting this information and presenting it to external users or parties or customers or vendors, or your executive team or your board, all of these things are going to be useful. It really just kind of comes back down to storytelling, right? And communication. So that's kind of really where I've seen success with remote teams, and kind of ensuring that expectation is set, I think, top down or generally held across the board. Where things kind of start to fall apart is where decisions are made in one kind of local location and then not communicated out well, or if certain power centers of a business tend to kind of sit in one area. I say power center because usually it's the executive team, but sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it's kind of like one engineering team, or sometimes it's one business area that just, brings in 80% of revenue and they're just kind of doing their thing. So if they're making decisions in a vacuum and they're not communicating out, this can be a symptom of being kind of geographically located in the same place and being together. But I've also seen it happen with remote teams, right? So I think it's just, again, that kind of mindfulness of communication and making sure that it is well documented and understood what your teams are working on and why. That's where I've kind of seen things break down and frustrations occur, right? Because you don't want to feel like you're left out just because you're not in the same city as someone. It seems silly, and feeling left out shouldn't be a problem. I think you feel at work, like you need this information in order to work productively and help your users and help your business, right? Yeah, that's where I've kind of seen things break down.
Hey, yeah, I think that
Yeah.
it's I think you definitely did emphasize on the fact that you obviously need to have the right company culture to even promote, I guess, be successful at being remote. And the communication aspect of it is very important, because most of it is async, because you're naturally not synchronous with being in different time zones. That forces you to document and write a lot more than normal. And out of curiosity, in like the companies that you worked at, I guess at Vimeo and Pendo, did y'all have a strong writing culture? Like, did y'all write a lot of docs?
I would say for both, yes. It was interesting because they were different in the ways of, I'd say, the cadences of those, but yes, for sure, both very strong. And it was really interesting to understand kind of how folks would then engage with those and sort of, argue with those. But yes, for sure, especially I would say in scenarios where teams are globally distributed, I would see that muscle be really, really strong, which was great.
And I did notice that you had GitLab and those remote docs linked to the About Me, which I found
Yeah.
pretty interesting, because I know GitLab is one of those orgs who have been remote from the first, and I think they're 100% remote. And I feel like even when COVID hit, they were like, hey, we've been there, done this for a while. Here's, I guess, a way that y'all can, I guess,
Yeah.
copy our ways of doing it. So I'll make sure to link that too for anybody who's remote, who's thinking of how they can improve their own, I guess, operations or the way that they lead their teams. I think that's a great doc. Fantastic. We're all ready for a bunch of rapid fire questions. Are you ready?
Oh, let's do it.
Sweet. First one, your most recent wow moment using a product.
Mid-Journey. It's just so cool to kind of see what it can come up with and what all that means. A fun fact about me, I'm a failed art major. I was supposed to be a dual film and fine arts major, and I just did not have the time to complete the art major portion of things. So we actually, I don't know, you can't see it in the frame, but one of my oil paintings is up here. But I find it so interesting what the technology is good at doing and what it isn't good at yet, and what that means in terms of the genres of art and the kind of styles of art that people are reliant upon and creating from it because of that. So we know that Midjourney is famously crap at hands, right? We know that Midjourney is really bad at, other than hands, I think, what is the other example recently?
I think fingers have been the worst. I think they've
Yes.
gotten better at everything else. They're
Yeah,
always 6 or
yeah.
7 fingers. I don't know why.
Yeah,
But
well,
yeah.
maybe it's just hands. I don't know. Which actually is funny because it's a very classic art school problem. Drawing hands is really hard, so it's good to know that AI has problems with it
Good to
too.
know. Sure.
But it's interesting because it's then it has implications for what does that mean for what it's used for, right? Ryan Broderick, who writes Garbage Day, who I follow and I just think is a delightful writer. He talks about kind of this kind of AI theme of art where everything sort of looks teal and pink and neon and heavy shadows and super high def, and everyone is wearing like spacesuits, or it's there's this kind of whole genre that is sort of being proven out, and I'm just curious like if that will continue as the service improves, or how it will be used going forward if it really does become limitless in a way. It's just really cool. It's fun. Yeah.
Yeah, I am obsessed with Midjourney too. I started paying for the subscription, and
Yep. Yep.
I'd like to think I'm sort of an amateur photographer. I do wheel camera whenever I can, and just looking at some of these pictures that Midjourney creates, it's absolutely insane. Especially when you know the parameters to give it the right lens and the focal length and the aperture and all of that. It does such a good job with its pictures. Yeah, I'm still amazed at how it does that.
Yeah.
I'm with you.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, someone already asked me. They're like, "Did you pay for the pro version?" I'm like, "Yeah, I've spent $10 on way
Yeah, for
stupider
sure.
stuff. This
It's
is a
totally
lot
worth
of
it.
fun." Yeah, exactly.
What's your favorite interview question?
Oh, this is a good one. I think one I tend to rely on maybe too much is, what is the hardest piece of feedback you've given, and what is the hardest piece of feedback you've received? Only because I'm curious kind of how truthful I can get folks to be with
That's a
me.
great question. That's a great
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
Because most people, when you ask them, what's your weakness? They always weakness seems like their strength, but they just quote it as, oh, this is my weakness. This is a good one.
Exactly. Yeah. Because, you someone has to get real with you at a certain point, right? And so like I said earlier, want to get to that moment of disagreement as quickly as possible, because then it means that we are respecting each other. We are having healthy conversations, and we are having conversations that are bettering the product and bettering the business. So this is a good way to kind of shortcut that. It also helps me understand if they have a good understanding of their strengths and weaknesses in reality, or, versus kind of whatever they're just, telling me in the interview. And also if they've had strong leadership and mentorship previously. I will work with a lot of folks that have kind of been burned before, or have just been kind of spinning their wheels as an IC for a long time and are looking for a lot more leadership and mentorship. This is a good way to kind of help me understand where they are in that regard as well.
Oh,
Yeah.
nice. Yeah, that's true. You can get a good signal out of that question too. I
Yeah.
could just borrow that. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Last question. I feel like I know the answer to this one, having discussed so far. If not a PM, what would you have been otherwise?
It's so funny. That question is almost impossible to me because it feels like PM was so hard won for me that I can't imagine doing anything else. But if I
Oh, wow.
was, I don't know, if I was to retire or do something else. We live by a pottery studio, and there's something really relaxing about being able to throw and just kind of work in a medium. I feel like I've exhausted my skills within oil painting and kind of other artistic areas. So I think it would maybe be, going to go be a pottery instructor, or just kind of make pottery.
Oh, that's awesome.
That's what I.
That's awesome. Yeah, I keep asking myself this question too. I feel like I had so many options that I wanted to do. I think I wanted to either go to VFX. At one point in time, I wanted to become a pilot, and I'm now learning to fly. But yeah,
Nice.
a lot of options.
Nice. Yeah.
But
That's
yeah,
good.
this has been great. Thank you so much, Cassidy, for spending the time with us. Where can people find you on the internet?
Yes, I am famously pretty low key. I don't really have a lot of social media. You can find me on my website, CassidyFein.com, CassidyFein. Find me on LinkedIn, or I am trying out Blue Sky. So if you're in there, you're hanging out, checking it out, you can find me at CassidyFein.bsky.social.
I will make sure to link all of them on our podcast notes. Any other call outs? Are you talking in any new conferences or anything coming up?
Yes, I will be speaking at Product Management Festival in Zurich in November. So if you find yourself in Europe or you are attending, please do not be shy. Come say hi. There is a great group of folks that are speaking as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Cassidy. This was a lot of fun. I hope you had fun too.
Thanks, man. I mean, this is awesome. Thanks for having me. Hopefully we'll chat again soon.
Absolutely. Sounds good.